If we are to cultivate and keep the garden, the question is, what companies do we invest in and how do we think about the products and services that they deliver? Today we'll be talking more about what it is to keep the garden, what those limits are in terms of the way that we look at those products and services, and how we select those as an investor.
So Spencer, if we're going to look back at what we have been talking about for the last couple episodes, really we want to peel back the layers of the onion and really see investing clearly. We as investors are not just investing in this ethereal market. We're actually deploying capital, we're clothing companies in capital for them to then deliver goods and services to the communities around them. And so if we think about the story of the garden, God is a worker. He created the world. He then placed man in it. And in our last episode, we talked about what does that mean to cultivate the land? And I think there's some real nuance here of God gives us dominion, but he doesn't ask us to take domination, a dominating approach to it of this is mine, I get to do whatever I want. And similarly, when we think about this idea of cultivating and keeping, God wants us to bring about goodness and truth and beauty from the world that he's created. We talked last week about the reality that God gives grain, but he empowers humans to then make bread, to put our hands to the soil, to cultivate it, to bring about goods and services from the world that God has made. So when we think about keeping, what are some things that we need to know about keeping the garden?
Well, again, we go back to this idea that everything that God made was good and humans very good, and that the fall has tainted or corrupted that in some ways, but there's still a level of goodness in all that he made. So as we think about what our job is, he has put boundaries on how we cultivate, how we innovate. He doesn't want us to just say, everything's on the table, just as long as we have efficiency, just as we get more. No, the actual way that we think about that is there is a keeping of the garden. And so as we look at that, in particular, that instruction really is, keeping is to cherish and to safeguard that beauty and goodness that is inherent in creation. When we're cultivating, it matters what we make. It's that beauty, goodness construct that we talk about. And so with creation, you could kind of think about this. There is a level of beauty and goodness that is manifest, that's already there. That all we have to do is say, okay, well, if we just plant a few more flowers, we're going to see that beauty displayed. There is a level of innovation, that we can apply to that so that we can plant more flowers and maybe have a greater beauty to that. There are also some practices, though, that we could put in place that would be detrimental. It might produce more flowers, but it would harm other elements, could harm people even with some of the pesticides, that we would use. So we have to be very careful. There's also hidden things within what God has created. And so there is goodness there within his world that maybe we don't see that is immediately manifest. And so part of what we do is we cultivate and innovate, like we were talking about last time with George Washington Carver. He figured out that there were some of these plants that he could use for products and services that no one had ever thought of. And so he took some of that hidden beauty and he made it manifest. Now, he did so, though, in a way that he was still in keeping with God's original intent and design. When you think about, say, peanuts, just being able to move a peanut, which is, delicious food for many of us, into peanut butter, well, that becomes now a product that's far easier than to distribute, to use, and particularly with peanuts, being able to help replenish the soil that had been damaged by over use with cotton and other types of cash crops. He was able then to kind of take that and move. So we think about that keeping, though, that is making sure that we're innovating in a way that is not then diminishing God's creation.
Yeah. Well, and I think that comes back to this broad idea of stewardship that we've talked about. When God employs us as stewards, he doesn't say you get to use the resources however you want. We are entrusted with God's resources to utilize them how God would want them to be used. It's not merely me as a steward, I get to do whatever I want to do with it. Right. It is I am put in charge of these things for a temporary time to then offer them back to the master. And so as we think about the garden, as we think about cultivating, as we think about keeping, we have to think about that in light of what is honoring to the Lord with those resources. Is he going to, in how we are bringing some of that hidden beauty out of the ground, is the way in which we are doing it the way that God would want us to do it? Is the way that we are doing it in a posture of stewardship, or is it a posture of, I just need to get what I need to get? And I think that's the difference here, is that when we look at good products versus bad products, when we look at what brings about beauty and goodness, it's, am I taking advantage of someone else just so that I can make more money? Or is it actually offering something to the world that brings about restoration and flourishing and goodness?
Right. And I think we have to acknowledge that there's always some level of gray among most companies. When we have, say, a fast food company, there is a product, a service that's being offered. It saves us some time. Some of the other practices maybe that they utilize in terms of creating or growing the food maybe are not quite as, desirable in some companies in particular, although with other companies, those practices are far stronger. But there's some level of gray that we have to acknowledge. But I think one of the things that we want to talk about today is getting into, well, are there companies that are out there that their products and services, it's hard to see any level of beauty and goodness come from them. Instead, it just seems like it's leading to a diminishment of people, of the world, of God's creation overall.
Yeah. And as we come back to kind of this general thesis, we look back at where we've come from before, and we see throughout Scripture, God says, do not take the profits that you've made off of these unjust means and try to bring them into the temple. They're an abomination. When Judas brought the blood money from betraying Jesus to the Pharisees, they didn't accept it back. They knew it was blood money. They knew it was ill-gotten gain. And so as we think about this idea of, we have fallen into sin. Our work has fallen into sin. The entirety of our being has fallen into sin. And so when we think about the companies that we own, who are we clothing in capital? Are we empowering them by our investment decisions to then bring about goodness and beauty to the world? Or are we empowering them to bring about destruction? And like you said, there is a whole lot of nuance and a whole lot of gray to this. But there are certain places where you could say, this is almost purely ill-gotten gain. This is almost purely a destructive behavior.
Right.
Those companies, they may give to a charity that I love and support, but that doesn't give them justification if they're creating a product that actively kills people.
Right.
So I think that that's the tension that we want to sit in here. It's that, yes, I cannot control what another human does. I cannot decide for you whether you smoke or drink or do any of these other vices. But what I can control is, am I profiting off of your destruction? And that's really the linchpin here, is, am I profiting off your destruction? And then just trying to close my eyes to where that profit comes from and saying, well, I'm just going to give it to God. Because God doesn't want it. He doesn't want the blood money.
Right. Well, and we see that, like you were talking about in the temple leaders, even those who were hypocritical in paying for Jesus's betrayal and demise. As we think about this, I think part of what we reflect on is, are these products and services, this level of diminishment, is it just primary? Is it just intrinsic to what this offering is? If we think about it, whether it is diminishing our neighbor, whether it is diminishing the environment, there's a lot of folks, I think, that would say, well, I'm skeptical about, all of the environmental regulations. Do I really care if one animal or another is protected in, one part of the country or another? But at the end of the day, I remember a couple decades ago when my parents had a place on the Tennessee River and could go out, water skiing. Well, the water skiing experience was not all that pleasant because there had been so much dumped in the Tennessee River. And, you can't fish from the Tennessee River, basically. You wouldn't want to eat fish from it because of the level of toxins, that are held therein. But even you get in the Tennessee River for, water skiing, and you have this film on you,
Yeah.
at the end of the experience. And you wonder, how much did I ingest here of just, all of these chemicals and such? And you just say, this doesn't feel great.
Yeah.
But we tend to turn away maybe if that happens in someone else's backyard. If we've got a polluter that is, 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away or across the globe, we tend to, say, well, that's just part of doing business. Well, I can tell you, if it's 1 mile up from where we were on the Tennessee River and they're just dumping all kinds of stuff in, I would have felt far different, because I like to get out on, the river in a kayak or canoe or fishing or, water skiing, these fun different things, because there's no capacity to do that in that same way if you've got, companies that are just dumping their chemicals in.
Right.
So Austin, as we think about this, what are some of the categories or ways that we would segment these bad products or bad services?
Yeah, so when we think about bad products and services, we think about things that actually destroy, that create addiction, that create death. And three that I think are fairly easy to set apart. These are not going to be comprehensive, but things that are like casinos, tobacco, and pornography. And again, when you look at it on the outset, you can say, well, I don't care if somebody else gambles. I don't care if somebody else smokes or watches pornography. What does that harm me? And I think, yes, that is an okay way to think, but I don't want to profit from their destruction. Again, I cannot choose whether you decide to participate in that, but I can choose whether I get money from that.
Right.
And so let's just take a look at each of those kind of in a more deep level to see what does each of these areas produce and how does it make its money? And then how am I participating in that? And so we look at casinos, and the reality is casinos are highly addictive. And I would even push this to sports betting. When casinos make money, they make a lot of money off of slot machines. In slot machines, there is a real return that happens immediately. You push a button, you pull a lever, and you see, did you win or did you lose? And the casino is going to make it so that at sometimes you win and at sometimes you lose, but it's going to spike your winning so that dopamine hits and so that you keep playing. But over a long period of time, you're guaranteed to lose. And casinos are like a funnel. They have 75% of the people practice what is socially responsible gambling, is what the industry would call it. But that only makes about 4% of the profit. Whereas the people that are addicted to gambling, it's about 25% of the population. They make about 95% of the profits for casinos. So they know that they're only making money off of those people that are going to just continue to push that button, push the button, push the button, and waste away their life savings. But as we've talked about, it's a funnel wherein those 25%, they're going to lose their money. It's a higher rate of suicide than the general population of those who are addicted to gambling. You're going to go bankrupt. You're going to lose more marriages. You're going to lose your homes. It's horrific. And then those people that may start off as responsible gamblers, well, they have to funnel into that place of addiction. And so really you're profiting off of the reality that people are going to not go to work. People are in Georgia, 61% of pathological gamblers in 2017 reported missing up to 5 days a month of work every month because of their addiction to gambling. And so we look at it and we say, with online sports books, it's kind of, you're starting to get that same dopamine response that you would get from a slot machine, where you used to only be able to gamble on a game or who got more passing yards in a game. But now you've got these prop bets where it's who's going to catch the next ball. Is it going to be a run or a pass? And so you've got this instant hit to where it just sucks you in. I was looking at one of these sports books, and from 2021 to 2023, they have nearly doubled the amount of monthly users. And at the same time, their revenue per users has increased from about $67 per user on a month-to-month basis to $113 per user on that same period. And so we're seeing that gambling is addictive and people are constantly losing money as they're playing. And so by me investing in that company, by me clothing them with capital, when those people get addicted, when they go bankrupt, when they lose all of their life savings,
Mm-hmm.
I get their money.
Right.
I don't like how that feels.
Right. Well, any company that we invest in, we should be able to root for on some level, because we want their revenue to increase, their profitability to increase. We want them to expand their operations. But if we think about a casino, online gambling, one of these businesses, the way that we get paid is that addiction increases. Mm-hmm. It's very linear. You know, you need more addicted people. You need more people using more revenue, pushing more money into that system, and then you will get a higher level of profitability, a higher level of dividends, a higher level of growth within that stock. But you're profiting from the outright destruction of people, like we talk about, because it's not, like you said, it's not the people who are doing things in a very moderate way that makes money. By and large, it's the folks that they are addicted and they cannot get out.
Right. And what we'll see about both this and the others is it's really exploitative in nature and it's predatory in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And casinos, sports betting, all of these things know how to prey on our natural instinct of thinking I'm going to win. Mm-hmm. When we look at other products or services that you buy and consume, there is a linear agreement. If I buy shampoo, I know that what I'm going to get is going to wash my hair.
But you're not going to take 90 showers a day, no matter how good that shampoo feels.
Right. But with gambling, it's the lure that you might win.
Right.
You're not actually putting money in with some sort of a quid pro quo per se. Mm-hmm. It is this lure. And so even these casino companies are doing much better at advertising to kids. Mm-hmm. They have apps on the App Store that kind of start pinging them of, well, if you buy this treasure chest, then you may get 50 extra coins to buy more treasure chests. Mm-hmm. So these companies are starting to really think about, how do I instill in children an addictive behavior so that later in life, then we can exploit their vulnerability.
And we look at that, and it's amazing how thoughtful they are in fostering this addiction. One of the things that's often cited and noted about casinos in particular is when you are playing that slot machine, there are no windows.
Yep.
There are no clocks. There's nothing outside that would distract you from pulling that lever or hitting that button.
Yep.
Because that's what they want you to do. And even if, there's people that have died because they have played this 3 and 4 or 5 days at a time and not slept. Yeah. It's that addictive for some people, and it's a gradient, it's a pathway. Right. So, there's no amount, I think, that you could say that's out there that's like, oh, well, this will never hurt you. Yeah. No, it's like smoking. Yeah. It's going to lead you potentially down that path. Now, it may not kill you, and there may not be all that much harm to one person, but as a population, there's no denying that they're trying to create a level of addiction. That's how they make their money, and anyone who enters there and begins puts themselves at greater risk.
Right. Well, and you mentioned smoking, so let's go to that, the tobacco industry. Tobacco is directly linked to numerous health-related issues. About 8 million people die every year from smoking. Mm-hmm. About 1.2 million are caused by secondhand smoke exposure. Mm-hmm. On average, smokers lose 15 years of life. Mm-hmm. It is one of the most direct causes of cancer. And so when we think about smoking, to the tobacco industry, tobacco, you can invest in tobacco companies. Mm-hmm. And again, it's one of these things where it seems innocuous. It seems like, it's just tobacco. Why do I want to avoid that? It can generate returns. Well, tobacco, yes, it is more regulated here in the States, but we look at abroad. And the World Health Organization and other studies have been done that have looked at globally. Mm-hmm. And they looked at 40 countries across the globe, from Latin America to Asia to Africa. And they started looking at where cigarette advertisements are in these countries. It's buy sugary drinks and candy and 1 meter, 3 feet off the ground. Mm-hmm. I don't know about your eye level, Spencer, but my eye level has not been 3 feet off the ground since I was, maybe 6 years old.
Right.
And they're in these places, they are targeting children.
Right.
because they know that they can exploit children and get them addicted to smoking. And then they profit off of that for years to come. They profit off of the destruction of humans. So when you put your money into a tobacco company, you are reducing the life of a smoker by 15 years. You are making money off of their death. There's just not a whole lot of way to get around. I don't want to profit off of the death of other people.
Right. Well, and it's like you said, it's easier to maybe rationalize it when we look at it in the States or in Europe or the West, because you say, okay, people, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 30 years, you've heard that smoking is bad for you. There's all kinds of different disclosures. There's all kinds of different lawsuits. But it's really the profitability. It's the same kind of thing with casinos. The profitability of these companies is no longer in the West, and it's no longer in the States. The lion's share of the profitability is in the developing world, where they can go to a soccer match and hand out cigarettes to 7-year-olds.
Yeah.
Because they're not being regulated in the same fashion.
Right.
And so you're maybe not contributing quite as directly to the detriment, to the destruction of your brother and sister locally. You certainly are doing that globally.
Yeah.
By investing in tobacco companies.
Yeah. And again, when we think about clothing them in capital, in the United States, smoking-related healthcare costs are about $170 billion. So we're clothing a tobacco company in capital to produce destructive behavior that then actually comes back and costs us more in the long run.
Well, and it's so interesting. We think about not just the direct impact, like you were talking about, to people when we've got, a loss of life and all kinds of different things, but it's also hurting second and third hand people. So we've all heard of secondhand smoke, where you're like my mom grew up in a family where her dad would go on long Sunday drives and would have the windows up and smoking for 2 and 3 hours at a time, and she's in the back seat. Tons of secondhand smoke that she's exposed to. But it's even the third-hand smoke that people are exposed to, where somebody's just puffing away in the car, they get out of the car, they go into work, and they're right next to you.
Yeah.
And so all of that smoke that's coming off them actually has health impacts for you.
Yeah.
As well. So even if we could say, well, that person knows what they're getting into, still societally, we are still harming second and third hand, people by those first decisions that are made in the West.
Right. And so the last one we're going to just touch on real briefly is pornography. The reality here is, again, we can go through, it's addictive, it's destructive. There's websites that we'll link to for all three of these. One is called Fight the New Drug. But what they talk about, one of the things is porn in a lot of ways fuels sex trafficking. People that are hired to create these films have often been trafficked into creating them. It's not a neutral industry.
Right.
It profits off of the destruction of people. We've talked about it before, that when you start watching pornography, there have been studies that have been done that as you watch, you become desensitized to what you're watching. And so you need something more, and you need something more to continue to get that dopamine response. And so there's this addictive behavior that comes about by watching it, and then it becomes worse and worse. And so there's often a correlation between escalating behavior and then objectifying the other, seeing women as objects of your desire. And so there's a higher likelihood of violence against women, or these other things that pornography is not neutral.
Right.
And so again, as we think about how do we invest, how do we close companies in capital, am I doing so in a way that exploits others, that leads to addiction, that leads to violence? If I am getting money from that, I don't want anything to do with it.
Right.
And God doesn't want it either.
Right.
He does not want those earnings then pushed back into the temple.
Right. You don't fundamentally want that company. Again, you're not rooting for that company. Are you really, investing in a company that you hope will ensnare more people in, just blatant lust, pornography, things, practices and pull of the heart away from God, away from loving God's creation, from his creatures, from your fellow human beings. It's virtually impossible to make an argument that this is a benefit to anybody that's out there.
Yeah. So Spencer, what are some of those other areas that we want to try to avoid?
Well, we've talked about those areas that lead to addiction, that lead to the detriment of people, generally speaking. Another area that we would look at would be those areas that lead to death. And the two main ones here would be abortion and weapons manufacturing. So those companies that manufacture products, services that would lead to abortion, that would facilitate abortion, companies that would offer those services, we would want to steer clear from those. Even for people who they may not have as much of a personal objection, to that, I think many of us could at least say that we don't want a company to be profiting off of maybe the most difficult decision that a woman will ever make in her life.
Yeah.
And certainly for those of us who look at abortion as a scourge and as an evil and as contrary to the biblical wisdom, we certainly want to avoid anything that has to do with that. The other side of things, though, is death. Just generally speaking, do we want to invest in products, services, in companies that will contribute to death? Whether that is weapons manufacturing, whether that is even companies that they may have a stated purpose of trying to contribute to the national defense, which every country is going to need to have a defense mechanism, defense complex and such. Again, the question would be, do we want to have companies that are really focused on defense, focused on creating weapons that kill people really efficiently? The government may say, okay, we must have a defense, we must have a way of solidifying that, but do I want to profit from that?
Yeah.
If we look at the early church in particular, one could not even participate in the army. Early church wanted to stay as far away from the potential to kill anyone as possible, and really was very willing to lay down their lives rather than get into conflict where you're going to have the potential of killing someone. So I think if we go back to a big picture of the trajectory of Christianity, and I think even if you look at what Augustine put together in a just war theory, there are very, very narrow constraints in terms of using force in ways that would harm other people. And it's really hard to get excited about investing in companies that their sole mission is putting together weapons that will kill people efficiently.
Yeah.
No matter who is behind that, whether it's a country that we would align with or not, align with, profiting off of that, has some challenges, and we recognize that there are a variety of opinions about that particular one. I think the earlier ones, it's easy to see, hey, we want to stay away from anything that will create addiction, harm, because it's hard to argue that there's any good that comes from that. Or abortion, I would say the same thing. With weapons, again, that may be an area that is a little bit more debated, but anything really, to me, I think to us, that creates that level of harm.
Right. Spencer, I think the reality here is, like you were saying, this is really nuanced. It's hard in some ways to navigate the weapons, but the reality is, it's how am I generating gains? How am I generating profits? Am I participating with companies whose focus is bringing about harm? And that's where I have to start really wrestling with, can I bring those things, those gains into the temple of the Lord? Can I bring money that has been made from the destruction of other humans into the temple? And that's what we have to wrestle with. So when you think about that, how do we seek wisdom from the Lord? How do we really start answering these questions of, okay, we've seen bad products, and how do we then look at what is a good product? How do we discern where do we deploy capital? How do we clothe those companies in capital to make good products?
Well, and I think we start here with an admission that we need wisdom.
Yeah.
So James 1:5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. So we want to go to Scripture and we want to say, I need wisdom, Lord. there is a lot to navigate here. But I think generally speaking, there's a few questions that we can ask ourselves that are good markers of whether the company is producing goods and services that we really get excited about, that we can get behind. We want to invest in companies that enable humans to flourish and to provide meaningful work that will allow employees to kind of use their God-given gifts and creativity, I should say. So as we do that, one of the questions that we would come back to typically would be, is this product or service meeting an important human need? Mm-hmm. And then secondarily, is this product a development that enhances the world and enhances people's lives, generally speaking? If we can answer yes to those two, or yes in many circumstances to those two, then perhaps it's something, again, that's worth at least considering. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of gray area here. There are, ways that food could be created or that services can be created, that there's some good and there's some bad in there. But it's those that you say, this isn't really an unmitigated harm to people. Yeah. At least the end result to people that we would want to steer clear from. Yeah. Again, at the end of the day, what we see is that God made the world very good and that He's instructed us to make it even better. Yeah. So let's invest in companies that give us that sense that we're going to make it even better. We hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. As always, if you have any questions, want to talk further, reach out to us. And until next time, take care. We want to thank our friends at the Eventide Center for Faith and Investing. Jason Meyer and his team did a fantastic job helping us to grapple with the biblical wisdom on investing. Many of the quotes and thought leaders that we cite come from their original research.
If you found this episode valuable, share it with a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss the next episode.
This content was provided by Second Half Stewardship. We are in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.secondhalfstewardship.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.